So I guess we could get started. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to the second day of our community design guidelines. As you're all aware, this is part of an MVP action grant that we received from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I'll introduce you back to Phil Thomason. Thank you, Phil.
Okay, thank you. Well, I appreciate your participation here this morning and look forward to a lot of dialogue and some back and forth on these design guideline issues. And I am assisted this morning with Lisa Craig with the Craig Group, and we have been working on resilient guidelines and resilient projects in a number of communities around the country, and just very pleased to be here in Nantucket. Got here on Tuesday and have spent the week taking photographs, walking the streets, and taking a look at the architecture and the various challenges that you have here in terms of flood resilience. So what I'd like to do this morning is to go through a first PowerPoint discussing the National Park Service guidelines with some specific more information than I had last week about the architecture and the again what Nantucket may be facing here in the flood zone. And then we'll take a break and come back and do a number of exercises. So I hope you'll be able to stay with us for the next several hours. So if we could go ahead, Kim, and start the PowerPoint, we'll get going here. So again, this is the Design Guidelines Workshop, and just want to recognize our many contributors here and those sponsoring the project and our partners. As you can see, there's a number of groups and organizations that are part of this this process. So I want to just thank all of those folks who have been able to give us support and get this project underway, and look forward to the final result here. So again, this workshop format, the National Park Service Guidelines on Flood Adaptation for Rehabilitating Historic Buildings. These are guidelines that came out about a year ago, and really the first time the National Park Service has addressed in detail flood adaptation for historic buildings. So we will have that presentation and discussion as we go through. Then we'll have about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and do some exercises with specific Nantucket examples, strategies for flood adaptation, and we'll see how that goes. So the purpose of the Design Guidelines project serve as an addendum to Building with Nantucket in Mind, supplemental design review by the Nantucket Historic District Commission, and inform preservation planning for the Nantucket Historical Commission and public. To address current approaches to design review and elevating and hardening historic properties, examine the potential for new construction within your historic districts, establishing parameters for elevated new construction that fits into the historic residential and commercial areas, and to provide user-friendly guidelines incorporating the photographs and other information for us here. So again, the graphics will be used to illustrate common architectural styles, building details, and recommended elevation techniques. So the timeline of the project, we started back in February, and between March and September, of course, we had issues with the quarantine of getting on the island, but we were able to do some research and survey of the resources in the Design Guideline Study area. Last Saturday, we had the first Community Design Guidelines Workshop, or Charette, and here we are today with the second one. Next month, be developing and submitting a design guidelines outline for the town to review and the HDC to review. And then in February, we will have the submittal of the draft Nantucket Flooding Adaptation and Building Elevation Design Guidelines. And then we're also back in April to do a Resilient Nantucket Public Forum. So we'll be back then. So the design guidelines are going to be based on national guidelines and standards. We have reviewed the Preservation Institute of Nantucket PIN projects that they've been working on, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. Field analysis, that's what I've been doing this week of the existing conditions, examples of flood proofing and elevation that have occurred already in the flood area here. Consultation with the staff, Nantucket Historical Commission and Historic District Commission, and review of best practices in state and local guidelines that we've had developed over the last few years. So just to go over some of the resources that are available out there. There we go. A lot of these resources have been developed since Katrina. Katrina just had a huge impact on the historic resources of New Orleans, and was one of the first major catastrophes that we had. That was followed by other floods in the Midwest, and then we have Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which also did devastation all along the Atlantic coast. So in response to that, FEMA really put together a number of resources. But let's look at Nantucket and sea level rise. Sea level rise estimates for the Massachusetts coastline projects possible sea level rise in the Commonwealth of up to 3.3 feet higher than global averages. Sea level rise data collected in Nantucket Harbor indicate that Nantucket's average sea level has been increasing by about 0.14 inches per year since 1965, rising to around 7.7 inches higher by 2020. The Town of Nantucket Coastal Risk Assessment and Resiliency Strategies study sums up the sea level rise threats Nantucket faces over the coming decades as, based on the 2017 NOAA projections and the 2018 Massachusetts projections, it is reasonable to expect relative sea level on the Nantucket coast to rise by at least 4 to 6 feet above 2000 levels by 2100. So we see here again just some of the tidal flooding, high water that has occurred over the last 10 to 20 years, and this is from September of this year. So here is the Nantucket Historic District outlined in blue and the core area in red. And again, what we've been looking at are the areas that are most at risk. The Nantucket Historic District, and also the Seaconset Historic District. Now, most of that is up on the higher ground, but you do have a number of streets that are, in the floodplain below the bluff in this community. And just to show you where the flood zones are here in the Nantucket Historic District, the AE zones and VE zones, velocity and elevation, really come up, past Washington Street, those blocks between Union and Washington, and on into the lower reaches of Union Street. So that's, and then extending further north, you get up into Brant Point area, North Water Street, South Water Street, and that whole residential area and commercial area that's just to the north of Brant Point. So all of these areas are the ones that have been identified as the most risk areas with the flood zones in the historic district and just outside the historic district. So one of the terms that we use here when we discuss the flood issues with historic buildings, one is the base flood elevation, the BFE, and that's the elevation of flooding, including wave height, having a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year, also known as base flood and 100-year flood. The BFE is the basis of insurance and floodplain management requirements and is shown on flood insurance rate maps, which are called FIRMs. So the BFE in the Nantucket Historic District varies from 7 to 9 feet, and the Seaconset Historic District varies from 9 feet to 10 feet in those areas. So in addition to the BFE, the Nantucket and Seaconset historic districts also have a design flood elevation, which is known as the DFE, and a regulatory flood protection elevation, the RFPE, which is 1 foot above the BFE, the base flood elevation. So the design flood elevation is a regulatory flood elevation adopted to add additional height as a factor of safety. This additional amount of height is also called the freeboard, which is the level at which a structure's lowest floor must be elevated or flood-proof to be in accordance with the town's floodplain management regulations. And this diagram just shows you kind of a basic where the water is at the foot of the building, the base flood elevation, the BFE. Then you've got the 1 foot freeboard there between the BFE and what is the design flood elevation, the DFE. The DFE again is the top of the lowest floor. And that's really what you're trying to achieve to keep your flood insurance premiums to a reasonable level. So again, just some information there about how you determine, again, the BFE and the DFE. So FEMA has, especially since Katrina, put out any number of resources, booklets, information. All of these pretty much can be just downloaded, and I would certainly encourage you to do that. One of the oldest is wet flood proofing requirements. It goes back to the 1990s. And then it's followed in 2008, flood damage resistant materials requirements. That gives you information about what materials are out there that will be most flood resistant for exteriors and interiors. And then flood proofing non-residential buildings. That came out in 2013. And that's particularly valuable in terms of commercial buildings and how to harden commercial buildings and keep them out of harm's way. Other resources, protecting building utility systems from flood damage. That gets into the issues of taking your utilities out of the basement area and elevating them. These can be elevated both inside or outside, as you see here in that upper right photo. Requirements for flood openings and foundation walls and walls of enclosures. And that came out just this year. And that gives you more information about where to put your flood vents, flood openings. And that's particularly important in terms of wet proofing. So that's another very good publication to receive, download. Then you also look at how you can utilize the landscape, resilient kind of nature-based solutions. So you've got the document utilizing nature-based solutions to enhance flood resilience and recovery. And on the right, building community resilience with nature-based solutions, a guide for local communities. And that gets more into the whole wetlands and what kind of plants you can have in your community that will help with water resistance. And then in terms of the historic buildings themselves, in 2005, we had integrating historic property and cultural resource considerations into hazard mitigation planning and floodplain management bulletin on historic structures that came out in 2008. And that came out again in response to Katrina. The building that you see there is an elevated house that was badly flooded in Katrina and was elevated some 9 feet. It's directly on the water on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain in Mandeville, Louisiana. And a bit drastic perhaps, but that's what they really felt they needed to do. We look at the National Park Service resources. In 2017, we had an update to the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, guidelines for preserving, rehabilitating, restoring, and reconstructing historic buildings. And that's also downloadable from the NPS website. And then, as I mentioned, in the last few years, we've had the Coastal Adaptation Strategies Handbook that came out by the NPS. And in November of last year, the guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. The National Park Service is now working on another publication that will be more illustrative in nature, and we hope to see that sometime in this next year. So that's again a good basis for our coastal resilience and design guidelines. Then we've had other states who have moved forward with this kind of information. From Florida, disaster mitigation for historic structures, protection strategies, and then elevation design guidelines that were created for Louisiana, again in the years after Katrina. Mississippi did the same thing after Katrina, elevation design guidelines for historic homes in the Mississippi Gulf Coast region. And then New Jersey, after Sandy, came in with their own elevation design guidelines for historic properties. All of these publications, again, are readily available online. Stockade Historic District, the city of Schenectady, New York, put this information out, flood mitigation design guidelines for this area, this neighborhood that's particularly prone to flooding. And then Miami Beach, which has not just from storms, but also just a lot of water that percolates up through their limestone. Buoyant City, Historic District Resiliency and Adaptation Guidelines, and this just came out this past year. So as you can see, we've got this increasing amount of information that we've been able to develop in terms of how do you resist water and create design guidelines for particular communities that are specific to that architecture and design. And Boston is another one of those communities that have put together a very good manual on resilient historic buildings design guidelines. And Charleston, just in the last few years, has created their own design guidelines for elevating historic buildings. And this was pretty controversial for the Board of Architectural Review for years, that they resisted the whole notion of elevation, but just with the recurring flooding that they've got and the realities of the cost of flood insurance, they have moved forward with allowing elevation in a number of areas, 3 to 4 feet in height. So you've got that underway also with the Board of Architectural Review. And again, Charleston, one of the first cities in the country to enact historic district zoning. So this was a major step for them to move into this direction. And then we look also at the Nantucket specific resources, the Town of Nantucket Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan, the results of the Community Resilience Building Workshop from last year, and then the Town of Nantucket Coastal Risk Assessment and Resiliency Strategies from 2020, earlier this year. And then we also are taking a look at, the PIN projects, the Preservation Institute of Nantucket projects, and, their study area right in this, Washington and to Union in this area, and what they were recommending. And again, just part of the studies that were done by Penn, South Washington Street and NISDA Harbor Cottages, looking at the history of this area and how it developed over time, and looking at the strategies in terms of the different water levels, flood levels that may be experienced on Lower Main Street. So you can see the buildings on Lower Main Street with the projection of 2040, 3.25, 2060, 4.5 feet, possible flooding, 2080, and 2100. And we will see how this evolves the rest of this century, I guess. So that's another one of the studies by Penn. So as we go through, the NPS design guidelines and recommendations, think about what are the best methods to make Nantucket's commercial buildings more resilient? Are flood walls or temporary barriers potential strategies? What architectural character of Nantucket's dwellings assist in dry flood proofing strategies? What architectural character assists in wet flood proofing strategies? And what are the challenges in elevating Nantucket's historic buildings? So going from the waterfront, you got the whole series of the buildings along Strait Wharf and the other wharfs out here. And, some of these are historic, but others, go back maybe into the 60s, 70s, and even later. And the question is, what do we do with these buildings over time? Are these elevated? Are these reconstructed? Are they moved? But these directly on the water are going to be, of course, the ones that are most vulnerable as we move forward. And then coming up Strait Wharf Street, we've got this streetscape with some historic buildings, some more modern buildings. But again, just as we move forward off the harbor and kind of do this gradual elevation up Main Street and Broad Street, what are the challenges that we have here with these kind of buildings? Some of the buildings out on the wharfs are at grade or at very low in their elevation. One story, the club building that you have here. And all the frame commercial buildings, these, there's really not much in the way of resilience to these buildings, the way that they are designed with the wood shingles all the way to the sidewalk level to their foundation, large openings. And, I think this is just a real challenge for buildings like this. Your brick buildings, a little bit more resilient. Of course, you only have a handful of these that are still down in the flood zone, but certainly something like this, the Whaling Museum, the brick is underneath the windows, at least to a certain extent water resistant, and then you can put a flood shield or some other kind of temporary barrier there in the doorway opening to keep the water out. And then the houses that you've got in the area between Washington and Union and along Union, and this is just an example on 5 Beaver Street of this dwelling, not particularly elevated above grade, that could be at risk. Union Street has on the north side, there's a number of the houses here that do have a fairly good elevation at this point, and may not have particular flood risks on the north side, but the south side may be at a little bit more problematic for those houses. But Union, certainly has just a wonderful streetscape, and the houses there uniformly stairs and raised basements and 2 stories or so in height. And just an example here of that kind of architectural design and how elevated you have these buildings already. It's 43 Union Street. 49 Union Street, the Basket Museum, again, a certain level of elevation here, use of the basement and stairs on the main facade here. And then Water Street. The Water Street has got a lot of residential units, appear to be, bed and breakfasts and rental units, as well as dwellings. And on the south side of the street, you're still pretty much in the flood zone. North side, like you have here at 20 North Water, this historic inn, maybe not so much, but you still have these issues with the window openings here in the basement level. And over on Easton, bungalow design here, and certain level of elevation that you have with this, but this is a particularly flood prone area out on this this street. And then commercial buildings back to a certain level of the brick resiliency that you have for the Pacific Club, for example. But needing some type of flood shields or barriers there at the doorway openings. So when we look at the flood adaptation guidelines, and I'm just going to sort of walk through these and mention some examples, both national examples and Nantucket examples. And this is where, please, any of your opinions, comments, just let Holly know, and we'll have a discussion. But the first thing is really, work on your planning, and that's what you all are doing now with all of the work on the resilience that's going on. Develop and implement a plan to reduce the risk or damage or destruction to the historic building. Undertake work to prevent or minimize the loss, damage, or destruction of the historic property while retaining and preserving significant features and the overall historic character of the building, its site, and setting. Ensure that when planning work to adapt for flooding, all feasible alternatives are considered, and that the options requiring the least alteration are considered first. Identify historic materials, features, and spaces that are important in defining the historic character of the property when planning and undertaking flooding adaptation treatments. So one of the ways that we're looking at in planning, and that's planning new buildings that are in flood zone areas. And so we see buildings like this where you have water resistant materials, basically concrete that's underneath the display windows like you see here, and steps to get up to the entrance, so the entrance isn't right on grade or just a step or two above. So it's up out of the flood level here. There is an ADA compliant entrance over on a side elevation, but this is one of the approaches here for new infill commercial construction, having this kind of hardening right along the street. And there's an adjacent building to this that has similar design. And you can see, again, the concrete bulkheads, as we call them. Those are the panels beneath the display windows. And these are of concrete. And then you've got the rectangular sort of panel here that's inset, which mimics the kind of frame panels that we oftentimes had in our storefronts from the 19th and early 20th century. So that's just part of the planning again, if you're going to look at infill construction in a commercial district. And that kind of raises a question, I guess, of your any sort of development planning for the wharf areas and the downtown commercial areas. Would commercial buildings like this that are of brick or frame with concrete hardening, would those be appropriate? So any thoughts that you have on that, please let me know. Otherwise, you're looking at elevating the first floor, like you see here. And this is designing a new commercial building, again, for the flood resilience that you have. This is a frame building, and how this was built, it's in keeping with the context of the frame buildings along the street nearby, which you can see what they do here with the elevation of, and this is up probably about 4.5 to 5 feet. And you see the piers, the concrete piers, the horizontal lattice work that you've got, or panels between the piers, and the elevated utility HVAC over on the left side. So that's the kind of commercial elevation that's also a possibility in your historic districts. Then you also look at temporary protective measures, and that's to select a temporary barrier system or equipment that will protect the historic building from the predicted type of flooding, and that can be deployed using the labor, equipment, and warning time available. Evaluate and ensure the ability of masonry walls and temporary flood barriers or other systems covering masonry openings to withstand the forces of flooding, and reinforce walls as necessary to withstand such forces. So a real basic one would be just using sandbags. And I see the use of sandbags in a number of places right around, downtown, your commercial buildings. And this is sandbagging a shed that's on Washington Street. But just some, very temporary kind of approach. You can get into more elaborate temporary designs where you have like a wall around your property, and then you use a floodgate at the driveway entrance, like you see here. And then there's also the use of these temporary flood barriers that you fill up with water, and you deploy these around your property in a way that keeps the worst of the flooding out. And again, this is only good for maybe 3 to 4 feet in terms of a flood level, but would these kind of techniques work and be something that's an option in your downtown and residential areas here? So looking around, you do have the use of, this is the Candle Street substation, these temporary barriers that can be deployed, when there is high water, and, certainly is workable and, not that expensive to deploy these sort of things as opposed to a more permanent barrier. And we also saw something fairly similar over on Harborview Way with the flood barriers here that can be pulled out and deployed when high water threatens and helps to keep the water back. So any thoughts that you have about these kind of temporary barrier systems, how useful they might be? Any comments? Other kind of approaches in this area to consider? Okay, if not, we'll move on. Okay.
Phil, actually, we do have a hand raised.
Yes, go ahead.
Mary Longacre. All right, Mary.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to provide a comment. I understand that the presentation is focused on buildings, but one of the challenges that we have on Nantucket is that we also need to maintain access to the wharves for the daily traffic of the boats. And so streetscape or street flooding becomes an important issue. And one of the concerns with any adaptation measures we might put in would be that we need to somehow maintain access. So we can't just close off streets when they flood with barriers. And so I just wanted to make that point to make sure that that is part of the consideration as you're recommending different strategies.
Yes, thank you so much. Appreciate the comment. Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
We do have another hand raised. Diane.
Hi there, everybody. I was interested, being that I live on Union Street at Fayette, which was in your pictures there. And we have the whole waterfront, Washington Street, going downtown and involving the piers. Instead, is there a way of looking at that as a whole thing instead of trying to lift or protect each single house, but some sort of thing along the arch of the harbor going up to the little creek so that it would cover that whole area without lifting individual houses and sort of destroying our streetscapes?
Yeah, so you're discussing a permanent barrier to protect that particular area, correct?
Right, which would go from the piers out to the
Right.
to the creeks, and
Yeah.
even further along that harbor invasion there. That instead of individual houses, we could come up with some sort of barrier that was there and protected the whole area without ruining our downtown old historic district.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Well, if I might just add, this is something, and I'm glad Vince is on the phone, because since we're looking at an island-wide plan, one of the things that we find, Diane, is we have to take into account not just the historic character, but the natural character, because historic sits within an environmental setting. And so when we look at options like those permanent flood barriers that might protect a certain area, the areas opposite would receive additional pressures from flooding. So I think we just try and keep in mind when we come up with design solutions, and hopefully the coastal resilience plan will play a significant role here. We have to consider the adjacent areas. So I think you bring up a very valid point that so many local governments are looking at. And that's something we may need to consider long-term. But in the meantime, those things obviously cost a significant amount of money for permanent structures, and they may or may not impact the character. So anyway, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. And, a number of communities, again, as part of, these temporary flood barriers include the flood shields. And you see a lot of these in Venice because of all the high water issues they've got going on there. Okay. So then we also look at site and landscaping adaptations, and that's to identify, retain, and preserve features of the historic setting that are important in defining its overall historic character before undertaking site mitigation work or changing the landscape or its features. Retain the topography and historic relationship between buildings and the site and setting, and select new infrastructure that is able to retain floodwaters on site, such as a cistern, bioswale, permeable pavers, green roofing, and associated rain collection systems. So this is where, you have site and landscaping adaptations, the use of plantings for water absorption and shoreline stabilization. So you have these plantings here, like in the median strip between the sidewalk and the street, that provide greater water absorption and our native materials. And then on the right, you see the planting of new seagrass to stabilize the dune system that you have. So looking around, we see as part of the use of the topography and encouraging retention of wetlands like you have here on Brant Point, and the retention of the water that you can have in this area. And the land bank property, this is on Washington Street down at the lower end behind some new houses that you have here. And the way that, again, just a place for the water to go and use of plant materials to reduce the adjacent flooding. And the land bank is pretty active. And this is another area here, a little section that they have right on Washington Street, and the vegetation that they have allowed to come back on this property. And then a land bank here on Easy Street, and we're obviously wanting to do some connectivity with the boardwalk. I'm not sure what the long-term plans are for the vegetation here, and one would hope that there would be some sort of use of natural plantings and the appropriate kind of vegetation to do water absorption. And there have been a few buildings that I've seen that, like at 14 Easy Street, with the resilient landscaping, where you have the absorption here and the kind of grasses that will keep the water down. And then you've got the elevated brick walkway here above the landscaping. And you turn the corner and you've got the elevated walkway of wood construction here that leads to the rear of the building. So I think this is a good example of the kind of resilient landscaping that you can also have in your downtown area and incorporate that. And permeable pavements, permeable materials that absorb water. And you have this for parking areas, like you see here on the left, and driveways, like you see here on the right. And one of the things that I've noticed in downtown is you've got just so much in the way of hard surfaces, and I see that part of the historic character of the cobblestone streets, and then you've got the brick sidewalks. But a number of your parking areas really are hard surfaced, and you might want to consider some permeable paving in those areas, like the Stop and Shop parking lot, for example. Just these kind of materials, you can have them designed to blend in with whatever historic environment that you've got in terms of color and texture. And again, they just do a really good, it's a really good method of having the water be more absorbed and avoiding all the runoff and flooding and ponding that you have in these kind of areas. Also, with site and landscaping adaptations, construct a levee, berm, or embankment on adjacent or nearby land outside the historic site or district to minimize impacts to the character of the historic property and increase the area of protection for the historic site or district. Design a new flood wall or berm, and to try to keep the or approve an existing barrier to provide flood proofing. So this is one of the dune barriers out at Seaconset Historic District, and it's a way of keeping the dune back, and there's a certain level of trying to stabilize the dunes with the plantings and everything. So you've got that going on, and you've got other illustrations here. This is back to that land bank again on Washington Street, where you've got the dune barrier just trying to keep the sand on one side and the vegetation and landscaping on the other side. So a certain amount of that you see here and there. But this is a concept that a lot of communities are looking at, and this is from New York, and where you install an earth berm flood wall, and we've got pedestrian access, and the pedestrians are walking on the top of the berm, on top of the flood wall. And then you look at more resilient landscaping on the downslope side, on the harbor side and not the water side. So just something to consider. I don't know if any areas like this would be can be adapted utilizing this kind of approach or method. I think we had a little bit of discussion about this last week, and I don't know if anybody wants to say anything else about this approach. Okay, we'll move on. And then utility protection, relocate all utilities above the established flood risk level or protect them in place with a watertight or impermeable enclosure. Relocate and anchor exterior mechanical equipment and fuel tanks to an elevated platform that is compatible with the building's historic character and is preferably on a secondary or otherwise less visible elevation. And then use fencing or landscaping to screen exterior mechanical equipment and reduce its visibility. We've got a lot of examples of elevation of utilities all throughout your flood zone area, and just a simple kind of, okay, let's bring this up a few feet and put this on a platform like you see here. And another example on this elevation of the air conditioning unit outside on Easton Street. And this is on Straight Wharf, a couple of units here that are on, again, these are on secondary elevations and are fine. Could use a little bit of screening, but you do have a lot of examples of good screening of your HVAC units. And so the example here for Wadler's Lane, where the HVAC is elevated and enclosed within the frame structure there, and just have the little gate that the mechanical units can be accessed by. But that's workable. And these kind of lattice panels like you see here at 8 Harborview Way, I think this is a very good effective screening on this elevation of the HVAC. And another example here of the unit and the kind of lattice panels that you have here. So overall, I'm seeing, really good elevation of these kind of units and good screening. You can also do screening, of course, with landscaping, plantings, and that sort of thing. So I see a lot of good examples here in your flood zones. Other flood adaptation guidelines that are in the National Park Service recommendations are dry floodproofing. And here, evaluate the strength of masonry walls and footings of historic buildings to ensure that they are strong enough to withstand floodwater pressure and flood-borne debris. Anchor the structure to the foundation with appropriate placement and engineering to prevent movement or collapse of the historic building. Prepare to effectively manage the incoming floodwaters and addressing moving and removing the water from the site and historic building after the flooding. Design temporary or permanent closures for all openings, i.e. doors and windows that are below and extend into the flood risk level while maintaining the historic character of the building. Install stanchions, fasteners, or tracks for flood shields in concealed or secondary locations and in a manner that does not damage, alter, or otherwise impact the historic character of the property. Build a low wall that is compatible with the historic building around basement windows to keep out floodwaters. So this is where we see, just keeping the water out. And this is, some approaches that you have here. Some buildings you might be able to do this external coating or covering impervious to flood water. Got to be real careful with this though, in terms of allowing the moisture to expand and contract out of your crawl space or your basement. Flood shields for your openings. And this is where, again, the maximum protection level is 3 feet, including your freeboard. This is really for those kind of properties that, are at kind of low risk levels for flooding here. And then also the backflow valve prevents sewer and drain backup. You need to put that in also. So one of the, keeping the water out are these temporary flood barriers like you see here. And, these, again, are good to, 3 to 4 feet where you have pretty much an impermeable wall surface, with a brick or concrete and the flood shields that are installed in the openings. And I mentioned this last week, but we were able to get inside this time around and really get some better photographs of your C Street substation, which has done a really good job. And I'm going to use this as an example, I think, in future presentations of what a great job this was, where you're changing the exterior appearance somewhat with this new brick skirt wall, but it does add this added layer of flood resistance. So you've got, the overall design of this building, retained and preserved. And these kind of brick skirt walls on buildings like this are not that unusual anyway from a historic and architectural point of view. Then you have your entrance that you see where you can put in on either side the flood shields, and they will just install directly into your brick skirt walls right there and provide flood resistance to the main opening, the main entrance. And then you have a secondary entrance on this side with the same kind of design with the flood shield pockets that you can fit your flood shields down into. And then when you look at the interior, the elevated electrical units that you have here that are off the floor, elevated up. And so that's certainly an approach in case water gets into the building, that you've at least got these important mechanical units that are out of harm's way. And then in the basement, you've got the pumping units that are also up off the floor. And I'm sure there are ways there you can pump the water out if you have any intrusion there. And then on the exterior, also mechanical units that are hardened with the concrete and then elevated like you see here. So this is a real good example of dry flood proofing and just keeping the water out of your building. So we're seeing these kind of adaptations for our historic commercial buildings in our coastal communities. And this is a design here where, the original storefront was pretty much gone except for the cast iron pilasters that you still see retained. And, they rebuilt the entrances with single light glass and wood doors that are certainly in keeping with the original design. And then you've got the bulkheads with the lower panels that historically would have been a frame or a brick, and this time they did it of concrete and will be painting that out to have more of a blended appearance. But this is I think a really good approach. You can put in again the flood shields and the entrances here. And it's a really good way of adaptation of these kind of traditional storefronts that we've got from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then this is just a close-up view of just a very simple kind of concrete panel here below the display windows. And you can do some decoration on this. You might even be able to put in some sort of decorative frame panels that may be more in keeping, and those could be where you remove those and just store them. But as I look around your downtown area in these blocks right off the water, in a lot of cases, both historic buildings and non-historic buildings, you've got your storefronts have been rebuilt a number of times. And this is an example here. It's a great example of a traditional storefront with the display windows on the lower frame panels. But this is where we really need to sort of discuss future sort of flood proofing of these kind of storefront designs. So then we look at wet flood proofing on the exteriors, and for wet flood proofing, follow the recommended structural engineering guidance for the number, size, and placement of hydrostatic flood vents, as well as any other ventilation requirements. Retain historic foundation vents in highly visible locations where feasible. Select a compatible design and placement for new vents or painting vents to blend in with the foundation material. Install a pumping system for draining the building in concert with the receding waters outside the property. So this is just a basic diagram of wet flood proofing, and where you're really letting the water flow through and where you're allowing the water to come into your basement or your crawl space, but you've got the flood vents that are 1 foot above grade to let the water come out. And of course, you've already, relocated the utilities out of the basement and moved them into another room on the first floor or into an upper floor space. And then your front door is above your base flood elevation there on the left. But again, just letting the water flow through and doing the least damage possible. So, and this is just showing how to use the flood vents to equalize the water pressure as the flooding occurs. And you would have, again, water seepage probably in any kind of a building that does not have a flood vent. But with the flood vent, you're able to do the wet flood proofing and let the water just kind of flow on through. So these are just sort of the typical sort of diagrams of where the flood vent needs to be about a foot above your grade, and then typical kind of designs that you have in the vents there in those illustrations below, where you use like masonry block in some cases, and those might be okay on a rear elevation that's not readily visible. Then you have the honeycomb or the pierced brick there in the middle, and then a typical metal flood vent there on the right. And so we see these in a number of houses and buildings in your historic district downtown. But where you don't have flood vents and you do have that unequal water pressure, you have a situation like this where your foundation really has extensive damage. And on the right, this is a historic house that's been elevated. And what they've done is to come in with the concrete foundation and any number of flood vents to let the water through. And you can see, in the background over there, that's the marsh right there. So you can see just how close they are to the water. But this is an example next of, where you've got, like a brick foundation and you cut in a flood vent at the right size and placement. So you've got these kind of flood vents to let the water flow through. And this is an example on Fayette Street with some flood vents that look like they've been put in relatively recent. And this is where it's been cut in. It's a foot above your grade and just added into the brick foundation on this property. And the next view shows you a close-up of what this looks like, and just very simple in design. They're pretty unobtrusive, but this is a good way of doing the wet flood proofing through the basement level. And another design here on this foundation at 2 Harbor View Way. Then we look at the interior wet flood proofing, retain historic materials, features, and finishes that are flood damage resistant, remove non-historic finishes and furnishings that absorb and trap moisture, use substitute materials that are more flood damage resistant when replacing deteriorated or destroyed historic materials and features that are compatible with the historic character of the building, replace character defining features with a substitute material that matches the design and appearance of the historic component, and relocate, if necessary, your electrical outlets and panels above the established flood risk level. So you make that as compatible as possible with the interior of your building. So wet flood proofing on the interior, looks like where you are putting in flood resistant floors, like you see here, tile floor or a marine grade wood floor there on the right, water resistant wall board and a baseboard or, wainscoting up to a chair rail. The chair rail helps prevent wicking further up, and then you can elevate your wall outlets. And again, one of the things that you have here, of course, these would be on the more modern commercial buildings that you might have, but of course you want to preserve and maintain any of your plaster walls. When plaster gets wet, typically you can dry that out and preserve and maintain those kind of materials. So, but this is a way of retrofitting the interior if needed, with wet flood proofing techniques. And the next slide shows a situation in a building that's really right next to the water, and it's flooded numerous times. And you can see here where they're taking out the drywall, and they're going to be putting in more flood resistant materials there, and putting in a marine grade floor on this building, replacing what you had there originally. Another approach that the National Park Service has in their recommendations is to fill the basement. And that's to assess the strength of basement walls and footings to ensure they are strong enough to support the fill after it is compacted, remove or break up non-porous or concrete basement floor slabs, use a fill material such as gravel, soil, or sand that could be removed in the future, compact the fill so that it protects the basement adequately from water entering the space, and relocate all systems and utilities, including HVAC, plumbing, and electrical, above the established flood risk level to a secondary interior space with minimal significance and visibility, or put it up in an attic or closet. So this is, we had this discussion last week where, a lot of these basement areas are used for living space. And what you lose when you use this approach and this technique. And in the exercises we'll be doing a little bit later, we'll discuss maybe some options that you might have as part of the basement question on what to do, not to mention the fact that if you do fill the basement, what do you do with the basement windows and how do you adapt those? And so that's a question that we'll delve into in a little bit more detail here after a while. But you do have these basement levels on a lot of your streets, especially Union Street. This is another example here with the basement apartment. And you can see again just how elevated this is up above the street level, sidewalk level. And another example here of your basement apartment on Union Street. And these are, you've got various foundation materials here. Some of these are concrete, some of these are brick with a concrete or parged surface. So there's lots of different kind of foundation materials that you've got on these streets. And just another example here of a basement apartment with a entryway into this living space here. And then there's elevation as another flood adaptation guideline. Identify, retain, and preserve materials and features of the building that are important in defining its overall historic character before elevating the building. Assess the impact of elevating a building on its historic character, including the aspects of the site, setting, and design of the property. Elevate later additions and porches that also contribute to the historic significance of the building along with the main structure. So when we look at low elevation projects in other communities, we've seen some things that work and some things that, some approaches that don't. And these are just some basic tenets that have come out of trial and error in some cases with these elevation projects. And that's where you want to align the porch columns and the foundation piers. So you have sort of a straight vertical appearance. Use a wide fascia board to divide the porch and piers, and then put a stair landing at the level of the original porch. So that's one way of bringing this up. And again, by low elevation, I'm talking maybe 3 to 4 feet when you have to do a elevation about that height. Okay. Another example here where the porch columns and the brick foundation piers are in alignment. You have the wide fascia board, which divides the porch and piers. The stair railing, wood railing ends at the level of your original porch level. And then your brick stairs match the brick piers. Just trying to keep those materials in compatibility. Another low elevation example here, where you have the rebuilt wood staircase, which leads to the front porch, keeping that orientation to the main entrance. The stone piers extended to the ground, and your porch columns align. You have the slatted wood panels between the foundation piers and the wide fascia board between the porch floor and the pier foundation. Another example here of this elevation. And then we get into the high elevation, and that causes a little bit more challenges, where you're really lifting these up maybe 7 to 9 feet in the air. And how do you do that in a way that really preserves and maintains integrity on these types of projects? So we're still, looking at, what are the best practices for these kind of high elevation projects. We're dealing with these in a number of our coastal communities along the Atlantic coast and the Carolinas, and of course, Florida and the Gulf Coast states. But this is, again, kind of the finished high elevation, where you're extending the craftsman style porch columns as a unified element to the piers, open risers on your stairs with a craftsman porch railing, just trying to keep that historic association as much as possible. Lattice panels appropriately placed behind and between the brick piers. And again, your appropriately sized fascia board beneath the porch and between the porch piers. So again, when you're doing these elevation projects, you're identifying and retaining the historic massing, scale, size, form, and proportional relationships of the major elements of the historic building or the district. You're designing a new foundation that preserves the historic character of the building. You're using existing attributes and features such as the large lot size, tall building height, visible foundation, porches, terrace, or stairs, and just ways to try to minimize the impact of the alterations to the historic character of the building as much as possible. But again, these high elevations, it can be a challenge. You need to construct a new foundation that is compatible with the historic character of the building. And then salvage and reuse historic materials and features like stone, brick, decorative vents, etc., from the historic foundation to construct the new foundation, particularly where visible, and match the new foundation to the visual characteristics of the historic foundation. So when we look at, building, there's 70 Washington Street, you've got these round concrete piers. And let's say you need to put this building up higher in the air. You need to elevate this just to get it, to meet the base flood elevation. And with the, next slide, what should this look like? What are your thoughts about this? I mean, if you're replacing these kind of just round, simple concrete piers, what would be appropriate? Would, square, rectangular concrete piers be acceptable? Brick, would you accept? Would brick be workable? Any thoughts on this would be appreciated. How do you do the most compatible piers for a building like this? Anybody want to venture an opinion on this?
Looks like Diane has an opinion. Let me unmute you. Unmute. There you go, Diane.
You hear me say they were not what we expect to see on Washington Street, these round piers. They should be concrete or brick, and they should be rectangular or square following down with the proper pattern in between so that you have the flow of the water. But those round ones are, to me, are not suitable for the area. And if they have to come down, then they can be changed to a square, which is our usual type of pier along there.
Very good. Appreciate that. Anyone else?
That's all.
Okay. Okay. And I think you have about the same kind of design here. The old commercial building here on Old North Wharf, where again, you've got kind of the rounded piers underneath. And again, as this building gets elevated, what would be the most appropriate design here? Obviously, concrete's probably going to what you're going to need to do because of its proximity to the water. But again, something rectangular, maybe with the parged kind of surface, would be more appropriate. Okay.
Phil, if I can
Yeah.
ask a question on that, I'm curious, have you seen examples where they may have that type of structural system, but as I think about it, for porches, for example, with historic districts, where we might allow for that as a structural system, but then wrap it with a some type of a material that would camouflage it in some way. I realize there needs to be a certain amount of resilience under the FEMA guidance, but have you seen where they do something like that and then maybe using a substitute synthetic material or just something that might be wood, but underneath the structural is really what is meeting the FEMA guidance?
Yes, I've seen a number of properties with, like the steel post, steel structural systems, but they are wrapped in a way, and sometimes it's, just a very simple kind of concrete skim coat that's around them, but clearly disguising the fact that these are steel support systems underneath the building. So yeah, I think there's different approaches that you can take. I've also seen steel where it's they've just built like a little one brick thick rectangular enclosure around them, so they fit in a lot better with the kind of foundation piers that you've got on adjacent buildings. So yeah, that's certainly there's certainly an approach I've seen. Mm-hmm. Okay. So as I look at foundations, I mean, you've got the brick and stone combinations like you have on this house on 7 Union Street. And you can see, openings there if anyone wanted to do the wet flood proofing and allow the water to flow through, you've got that opportunity on this foundation. Okay. A few of your houses have the foundations of rock face concrete block, and that's a common building material that was used in the early 1900s. And so certainly if you do any elevation here, try to salvage as much of this as you can and recreate it where you have readily visible elevations. Just some other examples of the foundations that you have. You've got, just the poured concrete foundations like you see here, and, fine appropriate, that's on 25 Washington Street. Some cases, the concrete, is exposed like you see here. It's just your exposed poured concrete. This is at 1 Mariner Way. And other examples, you've got the concrete that's got kind of that scored, that parged kind of scored appearance to give it a little bit more variety. So just some examples that you have here of the typical foundation and foundation materials in your historic district and the flood zones. Also we see a lot of this, of course, where you've got the vertical slats, and you see the flood vent here on 4 Whalers Lane. But the use of the vertical slats are, this pretty much a hallmark of a lot of your historic buildings, and the little skirt walls that you've got underneath your staircases, and just a very common design that you have throughout your historic district. And then lattice panels like you see here. I don't know if there's really any preference that the HDC has in terms of the design. If so, I'd like to know what that is, because I see a wide variety of both the vertical panels and then the lattice panel in the foundation. So any response on that? Is one preferred to another, or is it really just kind of up to the desires of the property owner? Okay, if there are no comments, we'll assume that both approaches are fine and appropriate, and we'll address that in our design guidelines. So, but we see these kind of the lattice panels, the vertical panels, very common usage in the other historic districts we've worked in for enclosing the areas under porches or underneath the house itself between whatever piers that you have. Also, in terms of elevation, use creative design techniques to minimize the perception of the change in height and appearance of the foundation of the historic building where compatible. Create an illusion of solidity in tall open foundations by installing louvers or traditional lattice between piers or posts. Create an illusion of a shorter foundation in wood-clad buildings by lowering the transition point from visible foundation materials to siding or weatherboard. So this is something we saw over at 9 Codfish Park Road, where you've got this elevated stair. And as a way of increasing, the elevation of this house, and also, I guess, way to transition between at grade and then the first floor level. And if you go on, you can see the more of a detail of the stair for this. And what do y'all think? What do you think of this approach on a house like this? Any thoughts about this kind of design, where you're basically extending and opening up the staircase to have the connectivity? Okay. No comment on this. We'll move on. Okay.
Actually, Phil,
Yeah,
it looks like Diane had
Okay.
raised her hand at some
Okay.
point. Vince raised his hand as well. So,
Okay, go ahead,
Just
please.
catching Diane. Diane is the one that wants to speak.
Yeah.
I'd just say that we are experimenting with the facades and the elevations in Codfish Park. I don't know yet exactly what position the HDC has technically on advising at how it should look to raise it above the flood level. I think that's something that we have to work on. I don't mind this type of extension, but it depends on where the building is and where it fits in. I think that's our concern in most places, like the trellis or the horizontal boards and the rest of it. It depends on what is there, not particularly what the owner wants. If we feel it doesn't fit in, then we would say so. But I do think we have to find out what the HDC should be able to advise people as far as this flooding is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bill, to
Yeah.
your previous comments about the approach from a street, obviously this is a situation looks like the setting is a bit different, but it's really that consistency of relationship between the site or the streetscape and the property. And it could be that this is one of those cottages that is, set back and perhaps not really a established pattern on the streetscape.
Mhm. Yeah, there's really kind of a variety of house designs and setbacks and that sort of thing right along, the beachfront here on Codfish Park Road. So it's some interesting variations that you have. Okay. And the chimneys, these are, challenges on exterior wall chimneys. If you do, especially the high elevation, like you've got there on the left, of really taking the chimney down, rebuilding it using brick that matches as much as you can, or just totally rebuilding the chimney if that's the case. On the right, you can see where this is more of a low elevation, but they did use salvage brick, historic brick, to extend the chimney down to the at-grade level. So, of course, many of your houses have the interior chimneys, and so that would be a little bit easier to do the elevation and retain those at the roof line, even if you are detaching them, from the ground level. So the next slide shows kind of the contrast here with, you've got the rebuilding on the high elevation there on the left, and then on the right you've got where you just retain the chimney at whatever interior location it is. And of course, the chimneys here on many of your houses are real architectural features and very distinctive aspects of defining the age and the character of your dwelling. So. And then also, as we move through, install flood vents and solid foundation walls, reuse historic foundation vents in highly visible locations where feasible, select a compatible design and placement for new vents, or paint the vents to blend with the foundation material. So we've seen some of the the metal foundation, metal flood vents, but I'm wondering if any kind of, I haven't seen any of this kind of honeycomb brick, pierced brick foundation materials yet in the flood zone area. Is this used in any other parts of the historic district? And if not, would this be an acceptable approach? Any thoughts on that, please?
Somebody else answer.
Because this is a pretty traditional design that we've got really on the Gulf Coast, on the Atlantic coast, probably up to about Virginia. I don't know if we really get into this much when you get into New Jersey and further north, but this kind of honeycomb brick, it's just kind of a traditional material and design. And don't know if you would feel that this would be appropriate for any of the lower high elevation projects in Nantucket.
I don't.
Okay.
Somebody else got to answer. I don't believe that in the houses that I've seen over the 20 some odd years I've been on the HDC, that I have seen that particular foundation. We we accept the vents that we have now, but if that foundation came to me in front of, when I was sitting on the HDC, I would turn it down because it doesn't fit into what we have as historic foundations. Not
Okay.
there isn't one hidden somewhere, but that's, I think, basically how we look at it.
Okay,
I
thank
think
you.
it's, Phil, I think it's interesting that, you know, when we think about what you saw prevalent in terms of lattice treatments, and I know my HDC always preferred the vertical, none of the kind of Home Depot diagonal stuff. This reminds me of a brick version of a wood lattice treatment. So it's interesting to see. And I think to Diane's point, it sounds like the preference for screening over the years, notwithstanding whether it was for elevation or not, is some type of a wood lattice treatment, even if it's between brick piers, much like it looks like what we're looking at here. So I think your site visit is showing a preference for wood, if I'm not mistaken, over a treatment like this.
Yeah, anyone else, any other thoughts about this approach?
I see that Valerie Oliver has her hand up as well. Holly is one of the co-hosts and has stepped away. Oh, she's coming back. So she might allow Valerie to speak.
Okay.
Hi, all. I my sincere apologies for stepping away. That's life. I will unmute Val. I can do that. Allow to talk. There you go, Val. I'm sorry. I'm hitting ask to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay.
You're good, Val. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. I was going to say what Lisa just said. I think that this honeycomb brick looks very similar to the lattice, and I surmise that people here would just choose lattice rather than stacking the bricks like that. And the image on the lower right, it is nowhere that I can think of here. So yeah, I think more traditional lattice.
Great. Well, thank you for your comments, because that's exactly what I'm looking for here is I look at options. And so this does not sound like this approach would be particularly approvable here. So thank you so much. Okay. All right, next. And I guess the same question with these kind of metal flood vents, it's sounding like maybe these decorative kind of designs also wouldn't be particularly viewed with favor. So anyway, just that's another option there that I think we'll sort of move on from, unless you have any objections.
Phil, it looks like we have a raised hand from Diane.
Okay, go ahead.
No, it must be from beyond.
Sounds good.
Okay.
They're not
Right.
appropriate. Those, I didn't have my hand.
Okay.
Didn't mean to. Thank you.
Sure. And then also part of elevation, retain a substantial visual connection of the building to the ground when using an open foundation type. Use piers, posts, or columns large enough in width or circumference to visually support the structure, with the number and placement of piers, posts, or columns similar to that of traditional building practices, even if the new technology structurally requires fewer supports. So this is where we get into, okay, if we ever have to go to, these more high elevation projects, again, use appropriate materials, brick piers, make sure that any porch columns are in alignment, the appropriate size railing, and then any kind of the correct kind of screening that either, it sounds like we're looking at either lattice panels or the vertical panels, which would be preferable. And again, when I'm talking about lattice, I'm talking about the real lattice. I'm not talking about the stuff like, Lisa mentioned going to Home Depot and getting the little flimsy stuff that you can just sort of tack on. These really have to be traditional manufactured designed lattice panels that have depth and, some solidity to them so that they do look like the traditional designs from the 19th and early 20th centuries, okay? And just some other examples here of, where you've got these high elevation piers with the concrete stucco kind of finish, and that can be over concrete or can be over brick if you want it that way. And again, just the panels like they're on the left of the lattice, and the right hand is designed with the horizontal panels. Don't think those would be appropriate. So it's nice to know that those kind of designs probably would not be preferred here. So. Okay. Retain the historic access locations and approach orientation to the building and its front or main entrance where feasible. Keep the physical features that identify the historic access points. Match new stairs, railings, or ramps with the style and features of the historic design, and salvage and reuse historic features to the greatest extent possible. And you really do have a lot of consistency in your stair designs. I'm sure this is something that's evolved over time, where these kind of square newel posts, the caps and the square balusters and the railing, it's just, you see these on a lot of the dwellings along Washington, Union, and the other streets. So that really gives me a good point of reference for, designs that would be appropriate, in the future in any kind of elevation project. So, you just see these staircases like this. Another design here, and this has got the vertical slats on the 8 Harborview Way dwelling. But again, the very simple kind of straight run stairs like you have in this case to the main entrance with the square newel post and the square balusters. So I see a lot of these kind of stairs that you have that, are in a lot of the same kind of traditional designs, okay? And another example here on Washington Street with this stair, and again, the same kind of double staircase here leading to the front door. And in this case, you see on the stairs, and this would be a recommendation. Yeah, next slide. You would see this recommendation to make these as water permeable as you can. You can see here with the slats where the water can, of course, go through on the treads, but we also see with the risers, in this case, they are solid, but there are recommendations by FEMA that the risers also have some type of openings in them. And so we'll have some examples of that in the design guidelines of just allowing, again, the water to permeate through as much as possible. Another example here with just the lattice panels under the stair in this case, how those work. Brick stairs. I don't know what your thoughts are about this. This is kind of a anomaly, I guess I saw, and I'm not sure how old this is. This stair looks like maybe 1940s, 1950s kind of vintage brick and concrete. But any thoughts about brick stairs? FEMA would requirements, I think, in the NPS guidelines would certainly find that a wood stair with the ability to have water flow through would be a much better design than this in terms of the brick, which has would just be shedding water off to the neighbors next door. So I think this is a design that we would not be recommending. But any thoughts on this? Brick stairs that as prevalent, I haven't seen that as opposed to the wood stairs. Okay, move on, all right.
Bill, we do have 2 hands raised.
Okay, please, go ahead, yeah.
I'm gonna unmute Val, excuse me.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I think this is the least desirable, and I can't think of another one on the island. So my guess is somebody probably just did that when they were doing a repair, and that happens a lot. Nobody applies for anything. So
Got it.
I agree with you. I think it needs to be wood.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and we have Mary.
Hi, less about the brick stairs, but we do commonly see stone materials. That looks like it might be sandstone for the treads. And that's one thing that I'd want to make sure that we honor is the use of stone as opposed to brick. Just a note there. To me, that looks like maybe the brick was filled in later, and the stone and the house are much older than just 50 years or so.
Okay, thank you.
Phil, one thing I would say to that as well, I appreciated that comment because sitting on a commission, looking the context and looking what possibly could be original material with later infill, let's say you had to elevate that house again. It seems there'd be a consistent material to use, obviously, for the foundation being what's there. But is that something, and I guess I would ask those on the HDC and staff, is that something where you would then require the property owner in the elevation to perhaps retain what may be seen as original stone steps, but create a different infill for the staircase?
We have Val. All right, you're unmuted, Val.
Yes, go ahead.
Val, you may need to unmute yourself if Holly's unmuted you. There you go.
I hate Zoom. Really. We haven't had that come up yet, so I really don't know how we would handle that.
Okay.
And most of the places that have stone steps are kind of elevated already, just like this one you took a picture of. So,
Okay. May not come up.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Doesn't look like we have any other questions.
Okay. So then we have, this elevated commercial building with the, the front of it remodeled somewhat with the elevated streetscape here. So just seeing, okay, next, just showing how this works. And what do y'all think about this? It's almost like you're trying to put in an ADA ramp, but it's not quite ADA compliant. You don't have any kind of railing here along that I think is really, really needed. But any thoughts on this property? It's and how this design came about. It's just kind of an interesting way, I guess, of their approach of trying to get better access once they got off of the grade and got elevated a little bit. I'm still kind of undecided about how successful this is. And again, just kind of curious about is this really their approach to ADA compliance, even without a traditional ADA kind of railing along it. But anyway, this is at 28 Easy Street, and I don't know if there's any thoughts about this, but wanted just to show this as an approach.
Phil, both our HDC advisory, not HDC advisory, but HDC commissioners are got their hands raised, so I'm going to unmute Diane.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, going back to this particular approach at 28 Easy Street, it's my memory going back some time that it was to deal with, they were doing Easy Street over in many respects, and they were doing it as a handicapped entry, but it was not done as a real application, so that the fencing was never put up. It was sort of a get what you can while you can. And I think if you see it down there, the whole facade, it is not anything that fits in on Easy Street, going back to when it was done, because Easy Street was a very simple street, and that particular staircase and then that wall and the rest of it is not something that I at this time would approve, but it was a fair length of time ago. So they were trying to get into the building. Those staircase, those cement stairs, granite stairs, and the thing, the railings going up to it, I think are inappropriate as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you.
And unmute Val. All right, Val, you got to unmute.
Okay.
There
Can
you
hear
go.
me?
Yes, go
We
ahead.
can.
Okay. So I actually kind of appreciate this because I think that it's a simple solution to gain some accessibility. It may not be perfectly ADA compliant, but can you imagine with all of these buildings in town having railing everywhere? I think, there needs to be a balance, especially in town, and it's an attempt to at least offer some accessibility. What I think is unsuccessful is the material that was used, and perhaps it probably should have had some kind of a vine growing, ivy, something to sort of mitigate that curb. It doesn't look like it's the traditional old curbing like down below on the street. It's more of a modern material, it appears to me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And that building is not historic. It's,
Right,
fairly new.
great, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your comments on that. I appreciate it.
Bill, we actually have one more from
Okay, go ahead.
Kadeem.
Hi, I was actually just going to say pretty much exactly what Val said. I think it's a pretty good attempt at just allowing some accessibility. I think railing would, definitely make it more ADA or compliant, but I also think the HDC would have hated to see a long strip of railing on that part of the, right here in town. So I'm not really sure what would be the best solution, but I think they did a pretty decent job with just trying to make it accessible, which a lot of places in town really aren't. So I just, I'm not sure what the perfect solution would be, but I think this is a pretty good attempt at something.
Great, thank you so much for your comment. Okay. All right. Construct railings with traditional proportions, or if a taller rail is necessary to meet code, retain a horizontal rail at the traditional railing height. Break up the run of stairs with a landing or change the design or materials where appropriate when a long run of stairs is required because of the change in elevation. Okay. Provide access via an exterior elevator, lift, or ramp located and designed to be compatible with the historic character of the property. Flood-proof or locate the operating system of the elevator or lift above the established flood risk level. and minimize the impact of ramps by installing them on secondary elevations when it does not compromise accessibility, or by screening them with plantings on more visible locations. And case in point of, our just past discussion, I mean, designing an appropriate ADA ramp for an elevated dwelling's problematic. It really is. And it's a real challenge, I think, for an architect or designer to come up with that to really fit into any kind of design review board's guidelines. So you see, this case on the left, that clearly doesn't work, and just is a huge impact to the appearance of this building. The one at the bottom right, maybe a little bit better. It's recessed back and allows access to the rear of the dwelling. But walked around and looked at a lot of your ADA ramps that you've got, and some of them work okay. Next slide. Here's one that, it's at least it's screened, and this gets you into this building on Salem Street. Use of wood shingles that you see there, kind of like a little skirt wall and that sort of thing. So you can see where there's really been a real desire to try to make this ramp blend in as much as possible. And there's other examples that are out there too. And I see what the attempt was for the building at 12 Straight Wharf, where you've got kind of the sidewalk that's been built up right in front to get you into the entrance, but then you've got kind of this. I'm not really sure what this is all about. The stone work that's in front of it. When why didn't you just continue the brick? I don't know, trying to make a difference here in the materials for whatever reason. But again, just there's a few other places downtown where you've got this same situation where you're building up the brick sidewalk and sort of like this curved alignment to get you in a door. And it works more around the corner. There's an example around the corner where, it's brick, but you also got the brick sidewalk. But anyway, this is just kind of an interesting attempt here, I think, on getting ADA access into this building. And then
Bill, Val has her hand raised.
Sure, go ahead. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Val.
I just wanted to speak to the question that Phil had about the change of materials here. And I believe traditionally the front facade of this building was all of that stone that you see.
I see.
The ramp was put in after for compliance. And actually this happened fairly recently. What's unusual is I think they cemented the stones into the space that they're in, which is very untraditional, and that caused a lot of angst. But it was an attempt to try and keep some of the original material in front of the facade.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for
Holly or Diane, you can back me up on that or tell me what it was.
I'll unmute Diane.
I believe on this particular thing that we looked at, we asked them, and they were supposed to do it with replacing the original slate, which is old, up closer to the door. And it was then to come down and be more gradual. This answer is completely opposite of what the HDC approved. If you go back, Val, do you remember that we had that discussion and this was done without a permit? And it's not what we asked for. We asked for the original stones to go up closer to the building and then slope down, not with that ledge. The ledge has been quite a thing because people tend to trip on it because there's no else place like that on a commercial wharf.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for the clarification. Appreciate that. Okay. And then, we discussed chair lifts last week, and then, this is just an example of where you use a chair lift to get into a historic property like this, with the ADA compliance. And, I think we're going to see more and more requests for these kind of chair lifts and ways to try to preserve and maintain, the character and stay away from the ADA ramps. And this is one that I thought was well done here. This is the building there at 4 Whalers Lane. And, clearly ADA accessible parking space, and you come in here and, the chairlift gets you up to the porch level. So I think this is a good example, and, we'll have other recommendations in our guidelines about how best to retrofit these kind of chairlift designs. Okay. And then alter the landscape by adding fill or constructing raised planters to reduce the amount of new foundation that is visible. Design new driveways, parking areas, or patios so that they are as unobtrusive as possible and are compatible with the historic character of the property of the district, and use permeable surfaces where possible. And this is just getting back to, again, that whole discussion of using permeable parking areas and driveways. This is at 28 Easton Street, gravel driveway there. Just really trying to utilize as much water absorption in your materials and stay away from the hard surfaces as much as possible. And, example here at 6 Beaver Street, you've got the gravel, but the ribbons, the brick ribbons are, that's a traditional kind of design for driveways from the early 20th century. I think something like this is certainly fine and appropriate. So again, another way of having the permeability. Plus you've just got the gravel that's on a number of your streets here and there too, which is fine and appropriate. So, okay. And then elevate buildings in historic districts that are similar in style and size to consistent heights, if that is the character of the district, while maintaining the historic, spatial, and architectural relationships between the buildings. It's where you do a whole group at a time as one approach. And then in terms of interior elevation, and this is especially appropriate for commercial buildings that may have good floor to ceiling heights, that you can put in another floor level, but maintain the original entrances and fenestration patterns on the exterior of the building. Access to the new floor level from the original entrance level should generally be made on the interior of the building. Maintain storefront glass and bulkhead heights at their original locations. Retain original windows on primary or highly visible facades, and protect windows that extend below the established flood risk level as much as you can with compatible materials. Okay. Preserve character, defining spaces, features, finishes when elevating the interior structure. Maintain the historic character of entrances while floodproofing the non-elevated access spaces. Add interior ramps or stairs that are compatible with the historic character of the entrance while maintaining historic features such as lobby spaces or commercial storefront spaces. Okay. So this is what showed this last week, but just want to reiterate, there's, I think, probably a limited number of buildings that you have downtown with the kind of floor to ceiling heights that are in the flood zones. But again, this is where you come in to a water resistant lobby and have stairs that take you up to a second floor. Well, it's really the first elevated floor. But you've got sufficient floor to ceiling heights that you're able to just sort of retrofit this floor in, creating almost this little lobby or design here. And, you can put in, like you see in the lower slide, the ADA compliant ramp. So that's an option that I think you've got for some of your commercial buildings. I'm not sure how widely used that could be, but it would certainly work for some of them. Mm-hmm. And then, a final sort of flood adaptation guideline, or one of the final ones, vacate or adapt the first floor, retain historic materials, features, and finishes that are flood damage resistant, remove non-historic finishes and furnishings that absorb and trap moisture, maintain and use existing access points, entrances, stairs, and elevator shafts to gain access to upper floors, add interior stairs, elevators, or lifts within the first story space away from windows or storefronts at the original first floor. And this is just where things get a little, recurring flooding over and over again, and maybe it makes sense just to, vacate the first floor, which they've done. And, like Havana, this is an example here. When I was in Cuba a few years ago, Venice, they have the same sort of situation. And, there may be just, we may find this in, like Miami Beach or something where, you got to vacate sort of the lobby spaces and move all that to the upper floor. So we'll see, but this is just one of those adaptation recommendations. And then, move the building, find an available site with a similar setting as possible to the original site of the building that also eliminates or reduces the flood risk. Document the historic building with photographs, a site plan, and the relationships to outbuildings and other site and landscape features noted. And, do the hire professional building mover and, who's covered by insurance. So, certainly moving buildings is an option if needed. And there are traditions of, moving buildings on the island, as you all know, and, just pick up the building and move it to another location that's appropriate. Example here, and then, okay. Another example here of moving and elevating this building, putting it on some terracing. This is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, after a really bad flood they had there in 2008. So, and I think walking around, heard that maybe, this building's proposed for demolition or moving. I mean, is this correct, or this is next to the building we looked at earlier on Easy Street that had been elevated. But what are the thoughts on this? Is this correct in terms of any proposals or applications for what to do with this building?
This was before the HDC for a proposed demo.
Okay.
Likewise, I believe it's coming to Concom as well.
Okay. And is this a historic building or relatively like within the last several decades kind of construction?
I believe it was pinpointed about the 40s or 50s. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but Val has her hand up and I'm gonna ask her to unmute.
Hi, I actually worked on this building in probably the early to mid 90s. It's owned by Robert Young, and it's been substantially altered from what was originally there. So I don't know that there's a whole lot of historic integrity left.
Okay, thank you. Okay, but anyway, moving, demolition, and here's an example here of clearly where a house used to be on this this lot, and you still have the garage, but the house went somewhere. I don't know if it was raised or just moved to another location, but that's you never want to lose properties like that, but that's also just another recourse with retreat if necessary, and moving or raising properties. So, well, folks, it's 12 o'clock, and appreciate your time and attention, and we'll take a 10-minute break, and I won't keep you past 1, I promise, and just take a little bit of time, and we'll go through some exercises that will certainly be helpful to me, and I hope will be helpful to you as well, to sort of look through several different completed examples of some projects here and projects that are underway, and just your thoughts about how successful or unsuccessful they may have been. So let's take a little bit of time, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes, please. Hope you all will come back. Thank you. Thanks for hanging in there, Holly.
Whenever you're ready to start, I just need to let NCTV know. Give them a little bit of a warning.
Yeah, I'm ready, Kim, if you want to just bring up the next PowerPoint.
Can you see it?
Yep, there it is. Okay, yeah, you can just go on to the next slide. That's fine.
And
Okay,
we're going to
so what are-
continue NCTV, if
Yeah.
that's okay with you.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Just want to make sure NCTV knew that we're continuing.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, so, okay. So what I want to do, like for the next 30, 45 minutes or so, is to review some of the projects that I've seen over the last few days and, talk about the potential for other kinds of projects that are in the resilience framework. So I want to look first at some of the elevation projects that you've had in Nantucket in the flood zone areas. One in particular that's underway right now. Look at the potential for the filling the basement kind of projects, storefront remodeling aspects, and then the wharf and waterfront buildings. So we'll go ahead and take a look at this one that's underway here. So this is 13 Union Street, and you have this elevated project that's underway. And you've got the concrete foundation with the parged sort of surface. And you have this particularly tall staircase with the very vertical boards. So yeah, next slide. You can just sort of see how this works going up and down the street. You know, it's streetscape view looking down the street, and you know, it's somewhat higher than the elevation of the other houses, but is it too high? Is it appropriate? And you know, next, the looking back the other way again in terms of the scale, the differences in the height with the other dwellings here on Union Street. Next. And in particular, you know, the staircase. I mean, is the staircase designed in a way, you know, again, we continue that vertical board kind of appearance. But is this just too much of a blank wall? Should it be broken up in any kind of way? You know, I guess I'm just trying to get an idea of how this project meets your guidelines and any changes that you would recommend in writing the elevation guidelines for a building like this. I think there's maybe one more slide for this project. Let's see. Yeah, this is just looking back at the foundation, the windows. This is on the north side of the street, or I'm sorry, that would be the west side of the street. You know, so their likelihood of flooding anytime soon is probably not as great as on the east side. But anyway, just thoughts about this this project. Does this one work? Would there be any changes to this? Any thoughts that you all might have about this?
I have 2 hands raised. I'm going to unmute Val.
Okay, thank you.
I agree with you. It's too high, but it was existing at that height, and they rebuilt it back to that height.
Okay.
And it wasn't. They didn't do anything to this building to lift it above the floodplain. It was more of a renovation in place, and they did replace the stair, but it was that high.
Okay. Very interesting. All right. Other comments? Was the stair but put back in a way that really this is very similar to the design it had before?
You know, I can't answer that. I could look back while you guys are discussing something and see if I have anything on it.
Yeah, just curious. Okay.
Yeah.
Did Diane have a comment? Diane?
Yes, I do. I believe when you look up 13, you'll find that 9 Union Street is the same height. I think that the staircase goes the same way. There were 2 down there at a fairly good height, higher than most along Union Street. The other question I want to ask, because I don't know the answer, is I spoke to a couple of people who were in the business of moving houses and raising them. And the cost that I was told, approximately the cost for raising a fairly small house, like one of the ones on Union Street, was about $100,000. With the extension of, because most of them have chimneys, with the extension of the chimney and all that stuff. So should we not consider what it would cost and really spend some time finding other ways than expecting people who live on Nantucket to pay $100,000 or more to raise a house?
Phil, you mind if I take a
Yeah,
stab at response?
go ahead and then, yeah, go
Okay.
ahead. Yeah.
Because I do have some questions too on the design considerations and integration with the floodplain management requirements that FEMA may have based on what Val talked about in terms of they didn't elevate it to a base flood or design flood elevation. My response to that, Diane, is that if this property owner is undertaking substantial improvement, and the test for substantial improvement for a property undergoing some type of renovation or rehabilitation is usually, are they spending more than the value of the building itself, 50%, I'm sorry, more than the value of the building. So let's say on this property, we've got the improvement, the building itself valued at $300,000. If
$2 million. The cost
okay,
to
thank
buy
you.
it would be
I
approximately
wasn't going
$2
to give an
million.
actual cost. I'm working math because I'm not great at math. So my
well, I
point
am
being-
too. I am
Okay.
too.
The point being, whatever the cost of the building, not the land, but the building is, if they spend over 50% of that cost on a rehabilitation, if, again, this comes back to the language in your flood plain management code, if it's historic, contributing historic, and it's exempted, then it doesn't have to meet the requirement for raising the building to the base or to the design flood elevation, as Bill talked about the base flood and the freeboard. But when you're talking about costs associated with a building that may or may not need flood insurance or may not be interested in being at the design flood elevation level, then it's their choice. They're choosing whether or not they want to elevate the building if it's not a flood insurance requirement, and if they're exempted because they're contributing. If it's new construction, that's a different scenario. They must put it up at the design flood elevation level. So yes, there are alternatives they could take other than elevation if they're not concerned about their flood insurance costs. Because that's what we have found, and Phil will justify this too, that's what we found in Charleston, is people just could not afford an annual payment of $60,000 for flood insurance. So that's the economic argument that's driving it. And I think you're right. That's why we're looking at this toolkit of choices for adapting the building. And I guess I would say in terms of this particular building, the things that strike me is that one, it looks like it's probably an occupied basement level, which you couldn't have if you were trying to make it consistent with the requirements for floodproofing. But secondarily, it does seem there are simple things that could have been done. Yes, if the property looked like that originally, Val may have seen whether or not it did. They have the ability to restore it to an original appearance. But if it didn't, Kim, I think there's a shot on the street of other elevations from the other direction. There you go. You see that one, the White House that has indicated, it looks like they probably have storage beneath it or something. At least there's some decorative detail there that breaks up the consideration of the very long vertical boards. And I'm not saying that, they have to do that, but I think that is something as a HDC, you'd have the opportunity to say with that kind of height, obviously vegetation may not work and it may not be appropriate, but is there detailing? Is there a faux door look, that's comparable? Because you've got a property down the street that's done something similar. It's always coming around to looking at what's in your existing environment. And is there something we can do to create less emphasis on that verticality in a situation where you've got a very strong horizontal to your material. So I don't know. I think you may have an option, even if it's a return to something more original, if appropriate, and if they're interested in hearing that choice. So I don't know if that answered any questions, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, and just to reinforce what Lisa said about the situation in Charleston, yeah, you are just kind of confronted with spending six figures to do this elevation and, you know, retrofitting of your property, but you look at what your return on investment is going to be over time to defray the large increases in your flood insurance premium. So it's just, yeah, it's expensive, but you just have to look at, you know, the life expectancy of your property and, you know, your potential for resale in the future. So there's a lot of financial ramifications to these kind of projects. Okay, anything else about this this building? And we'll move on to the next.
Phil, Val found a reconstruction photograph from the street view that I will email to you, Lisa, and Kim for the files, but it will show basically prior to this work here.
Great.
Thank you, Val, for that, by the way.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
We also do have one other hand up from Mary, if you want to take her question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, so Phil, for your benefit, that side of Union Street is hard up against a bank behind the houses. And
Yes.
over the decades, that bank has been collapsing slowly. There is no stormwater system on the street, Orange Street, that's behind there. So the elevation of the houses might also depend on the situation in their backyards. Just a point of clarification for you.
Yeah.
I would also make a plea for not being too constraining in the guidelines. We have 4 centuries of home building on Nantucket and variety. And I like that. I do not want to see something that every house is exactly the same height with exactly the same features, with exactly the same treatments. It's the variety that makes it look real and not like Disneyland or Williamsburg. So I just wanted to make sure that, within the scope of the necessary flood adaptation, we are not being too restrictive in allowing the homes to still have some individual expression.
Thank you. Yeah, agree. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay. Okay, 5759 Washington Street. So you've got these 2 elevation projects, I believe, in the last number of years. And any thoughts, Kimmy? I think you just sort of go through the slides back and forth, and at least just for 57 first. But you see here, you know, up on the foundation with the vertical panels again. The staircase, which is the traditional design that we see, traditional railing, and got that design. Okay, next. Another view. And again, the porch being with the vertical panels, and then the house itself on what appears to be concrete with just the parged surface. And a close up here of the foundation and how that was handled. Close up of the porch and the vertical panels that you've got there. Okay. And the staircase again with the square newel posts, the caps, and the square baluster. So then we go on to the other house and kind of the design here. It's got a little bit more different stair design with the more of the interior inside the porch, the plane of the porch, but the same sort of vertical panels below, and the way that was handled on the porch. And I show this also, this is at the rear, kind of the rear building, and how they did some elevation with this terracing and the landscaping. And I thought that was pretty interesting within, these concrete kind of planters in a way of doing some additional waterproofing there. But I think most of the historic preservation commissions I've worked with would feel like this is successful. They would have approved this, and just want to see if there's any thoughts from you, any HDC members who want to talk about these two houses.
I have a hand raised from Val. I'm going to unmute her.
Okay.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I agree with you. We really do like the tiered approach, but we've run into some conflict with the Conservation Commission not necessarily liking that. And I'm wondering if there's like perhaps a compromise situation there, like that planter could be, let's say, just stone that is on end, forming to look like a planter, but in fact below it, it's just dirt and soil. So there is some ability for the water to flow through. It really does help mitigate the verticality of when we lift these buildings. And on the front, my suspicion is, and I can't remember this, that we also contend with zoning. So sometimes stairs have to be sort of tucked away. They can't come out to the street because they'll be in a setback. And I think that having the fence run along the street actually really helps this as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that, again, most preservation commissions or boards of architectural review would be very comfortable with these two designs.
Yeah.
And I guess the objection on the conservation front is that material back in the back of the terracing should be more permeable.
Right.
Okay, all right, that's good to know. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, any other
Yeah.
comments on these two?
We have another hand up from Mary.
Okay.
All right, I'm meeting you, Mary.
So just for background, I happen to work for the company that did this project. 57 is an 18th century home that was at grade, and it was renovated. The lot was subdivided, and 59 was built fresh just a couple of years ago, to be in a compatible style with 57. So that's just a little bit of the history of those two particular buildings.
So one's relatively recent and one's historic.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay.
Bill, this property, just to give you a little bit more on that, because it actually is a distant relative on my husband's side. But this property this structure right here on the right-hand side is the original historic structure.
Yeah.
That was more in the center of the property. The property was subdivided. And then there was a garage that was actually on there as well that was removed. And essentially there is a primary and a secondary on both those lots. So needless to say, I will tell you, I did the final inspection on behalf of the HDC. There are multiple COAs that are associated with this overall project. So this, I can definitely understand why this would be something that wouldn't be necessarily all the specifics associated with it. We're not on the top of everybody's mind at the moment, but yeah, this was a very extensive, I think lengthy process for this review process for the HTC. But needless to say, I think it is successful in my opinion.
Great. Okay. All right, we can run through these and go on to the next project.
No, I wanted to say something.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, Diane, go ahead.
Well, this 57 Washington Street belonged to my son-in-law and his family for ages beforehand. The the house was up front and closest to the street. In the back, there was a garage and 2 cottages. The land, when it flooded their basement regularly. And the land behind that have now got 2 more houses on it flooded also, but it had a garden and the garage was old and it didn't flood for some reason, but the cottages did and the land around it. But when these cottages or houses in the back were put on, it was not brought to our mind about the ability to absorb water. It never entered our discussion that I remember. I couldn't sit on it because it was a relative, but I followed it because the house had been there for some time untouched. But it has been made so it has lost the ability to absorb flooding water. A great deal more has become built. So all the things between the old house and the cottages in back, the decks and the patios and stuff, none of them are water absorbent, to put it that way. It's unfortunate because we should have considered that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Mhm. Okay,
Thank you.
sure, thank you. Okay, moving on down the street to the Middle Street houses. And yeah, let's sort of walk through this and see what you all think. So you have these basically 1-story houses, maybe 1.5. The horizontal slat design in the foundation, above the foundation, doing the screening. You know, the staircases are the traditional kind of staircases with a square newel post, square railing. You know, obviously these are substantial heights. You know, that one's certainly, you know, maybe 6-7 feet, something like that. And then a little bit less would be the house that's closest to Washington Street. That's the one that showed just a bit ago. Yeah, okay, so you got these 2 that are pretty next to each other. And then the one that's looking back at these. So anyway, these houses, what do you think of the success here, or how, if you had it to do over again, how would the design review of this be different? Or are they fine as is?
Unmuting Val.
I actually don't think this is a successful approach because one, the horizontal boards are, I think, too much of an anomaly in town, and I'm not really sure why that passed the way it did. But what's hard about these houses is they were all so small and in the proximity they have to one another. And I find that having them all raised to the same height, and now they're all coming back to want to put dormers on the front, and they really are, it's an ongoing problem. And I don't think this is as successful as the ones around the corner that you just pointed out.
Okay, all right. Okay, any other comments?
Yeah, I have one.
Go ahead.
I agree with Val completely. It is such a unsuccessful development of the 3 little houses, for 1, 2, 3. I think there were 3 to begin with. Little houses, 1 story. They were tiny, and they went up a driveway, and they. I am not aware over the history, and I've lived up the street for 40 some odd years, 47 years, of them flooding. And when this sideboards were put in, we didn't, the edict of having to raise the buildings had just come in, and I think we really didn't understand it all, because these sideways horizontal boards are totally out of whack with the rest of the thing. You drive along the street and people say, what is that? There were other ways of doing it and giving the houses some originality rather than doing what has been done in this area. It is not considered a niche application.
Yeah, and I think some of
That's-
the preservation commissions that I have worked with in the past, they would really sort of go back to the overall site plan and, why can't these, look at these properties actually facing the alley in terms of a sense of the primary facade, and take the parking in front off and put parking in the rear. I'm obviously not real cognizant of all the site planning issues here, but I'm just thinking that, there would be certainly the desire to have more of a primary elevation towards any kind of driveway or street, and take the parking directly off of in front of the buildings. But
Right, the parking originally was in the middle, and 2 houses were on the right going down towards the water, and the third one was on the left going up towards Union Street. And there was sort of a central parking. It was, easy going, and but it fit in with the planting and all the rest of it. Now you've got 4 square bricks that do not acclimate themselves at all to the existing street, as you say, and the parking.
okay. All right, any other comments about this project? Okay, next. No, that's part of the same. Yeah, keep going. Okay. So this is just a little further down the street. Down on Washington, excuse me. And this another looks like recent elevation project. And here, here's the parking, the facade that you see there on the left that faces that wetland that the land bank has. So, this is how that primary entrance is oriented. But the horizontal slats here, and if you want to do a close-up, next slide is a close-up of the stair and the horizontal slats. Those at least are less obtrusive, I think, in terms of a design element, where they're much more narrower than the Metter Street properties. So any comments about the success of this project?
Got Val. All right, you're unmuted.
Where is this? Washington Street. So is this one of the series of 4 houses that were built as new?
That's correct. I believe that's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
I believe this was part of the Clarkson Gully property.
Yeah. I really don't like these houses at all. All at the same height. You're right, that's a little more successful, and I would say too, I appreciate they didn't close in under the stair. I think that gives it a little bit lighter feeling too. But this particular grouping of houses, I think, was really what made us go, holy moly, if this is what we're in for, we're in big trouble.
Okay.
Bill, if I can say something, I think that it goes to show that preservation, especially when we're dealing with these adaptation methods and how to disguise everything, is kind of a trial and error. And it's, oh, well, we tried this, we don't really like it, let's try not to do that again. I think a lot of this process, especially with the 15 meter street and the 115 Washington Street, it's showing that, okay, we've tried this. It doesn't really fit with what we want. We like the vertical slats better. Let's in the future make sure that the vertical slats are used. I think it's showing that evolution of thought in the preservation movement on the island.
Yeah, Kim, that's a good point, because in a lot of the communities, again, that I've been working in, yeah, this is kind of trial and error. And, all right, we did this design and improved it, and now looking back, yeah, it's not really as compatible as we thought it might be. So, yeah, there is a certain level of the trial and error here, and just seeing what really stands the test of time, as well as meeting all the different kinds of flood proofing requirements. So, okay, if there's not anything else on this, go to next. Okay, so the questions about filling in the basement. And, in some cases here you've got, okay, this is 6 Union Street. This is the Washington Street elevation. And this is pretty close to the harbor, and I'm sure there's potential for some serious flooding issues in the future. And they do use this as a basement apartment here. And so you see the basement windows, but the way this house is on the lot, if you go to the next slide, you'll see on the Union Street elevation, I mean, they're really pretty much landlocked, and not too many ways that you can expand. I mean, perhaps you see the little 1-story wing there on the left side. Maybe can a house like this, if they lose the basement space, would you allow like a 2-story wing to replace that space? Would you allow another half story perhaps on a house like this? Just kind of looking at what your options are for this approach, and is filling the basement really as viable for Nantucket as it is for other communities. I've got a series of these, and if you want to wait until we sort of scroll through several more, then we can have kind of an overall discussion if you like. So yeah, let's just do that. So go to the next slide, and then, okay, so here's this house on Union, another basement apartment. And if you fill the basement, can you do a dormer off the cat slide roof on the back, the sloping roof on the back? And this is looking, it's already got this substantial kind of wing that's at the rear. But would you find some way to enlarge the house even further? Or I know you got the slope and the drainage issues at the back, and you see the little garage back behind it. Could that be taken down and you put an elevated secondary space back there? Okay, next. This is also, on Union, and where, obviously a very nice garage, basement apartment here that opens onto this courtyard. And the house itself is already, pretty substantial in terms of its size. But if you lost this space, Would you allow like a rear roof addition, kind of where that shed dormer is with the widow's walk up at the top, and just an expansion that way to reclaim the space that you lose in the basement? And one more example, this is just kind of looking on North Water, and you see the density that you've got with all of these different rental units and apartments and that sort of thing. Like the second house, for example, where you've got the window air conditioner in the basement and first floor, second floor, and the attic, gable dormer. I mean, you can see that all of this space is being heavily utilized. So the building across the street, if you go one more, so you go to this house on North Water. So you've got the basement unit here, and you can see the apartment, how that's rented out, I expect. And then next, you see the rear of this property, and the option perhaps of reclaiming that space through a second floor addition as this comes out from the roof line. And it also has on the property a garage, which I'm sure would be a contributing little building to your historic district, but as another option of taking that down and putting in a separate apartment building there. So I just show you these options in terms of, the filling the basement question. How viable is that really for your houses here in Nantucket, given how heavily used they are and how their income for the property owners? And this is just very valuable space. So any thoughts you all have about this, please, this approach?
I'm going to unmute Val.
I think that's an interesting thought, but I see that changing the architecture so significantly that I don't think I'd be in favor of that. I'm wondering if those are situations that could use, as you pointed out earlier, the temporary shield type of arrangement, or is there any sort of mechanical pumping trough moat type of system that could be used to suck up the water before it gets in there?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are the temporary barriers approach, and I showed some examples of that. And that'll work again for, water levels that may be 3 to 4 feet that are encroaching. So, yeah, but I hear what you're saying in terms of just, how drastic that might be to reclaim that space through rooftop additions or rear additions or removals of secondary buildings and building something else. So, okay, I hear that. Anybody else?
Bill, I just want to add to that though. Similarly, in Annapolis, what we found is it wasn't the barrier so much, Val, it was that water was coming up through the stormwater system into the basements and flooding the basements rather than coming from the exterior, because those were kind of below the flood elevation. So I think that it may be useful to understand, I don't know quite where this fits into the Nantucket Stormwater Program, but it may be useful to understand maybe backflow preventers that are in the house versus out just in the public way out at the water level. That's public infrastructure. So maybe something to investigate, because it has been my experience that flooding happens in the basement because of backups.
Gotcha.
Okay, anyone else on this design issue?
Yes, Diane has her hand up.
I think that we have to come up with a better problem of basement flooding, which most of the ones that we have here, we have a new sewer system runoff water system in under David Gray, who is our director, who's doing a remarkable job and fixed the ones down at Broad Street and stuff when it broke down a year ago. I don't know what the point is of taking, except to make these houses a place for people to live, is to take a historic area and change everything, get rid of the old garages so you can put in what you need. If I don't know, I sometimes go by the theory, if you can't deal with it, then don't buy it. But the people here are proud of their houses, and they're willing to do anything, but to take them and change them is something I don't see them doing. First of all, as I brought up before, a little misunderstood, I guess, about the expense of doing all this work, and how, with the number of retired people that live here, how they are expected to pay. We don't pay. I don't pay that much on my flood insurance, and yet I'm in a zone A flood thing. I think it has to be more considered to maintain the historic issue of the island and the houses for the people to live in, and the cost of repairing them. And I don't think plunking them on the back of houses, or taking down garages, or taking away one house to put in a basement thing, I don't know. It's not something that I can understand at this time.
Thank you. Mhm. Okay, anyone else about filling the basement? I think we're about ready to move on to the next issue here. There's only a couple more, and we'll wrap it up. Okay. Okay, next. Okay, so we look at the Main Street commercial buildings. This is just view down the street, and view back up the street. And looking at the storefronts that you have, I mean, a lot of the storefronts have been changed over time, and there's not a lot of original materials, especially for the frame storefronts that I've seen. So the frame storefronts are the ones that are going to be the most vulnerable as you look at the rising flooding and sea level issues. And so here's an example of a I don't whatever this dates to, but then it's got the frame bulkheads underneath the windows. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, go to the next slide. There's more of a detail here that I'm talking about. So it's how do we make those more flood resistant? And again, I showed the use of concrete in place of frame bulkheads like this. Another example of just a frame bulkhead, and I think this is a relatively new building, 1997. Another rebuilt storefront here with these frame bulkheads, and just retrofitting in as needed with different hardening materials, and the kind of concrete wash or parging. Same thing here with the entryway of the panels below the display windows, and the wood shingles. I mean, there's going to have to be some real thought about what is behind those shingles. I mean, if you want to put shingles there but have the concrete bulkheads behind them, I think that's certainly fine. I mean, you're just dealing with drying out and replacing the shingles as needed. But that's but overall, if it's just a frame stud system under that, then obviously that's not going to be water resistant. Another example here where you've got kind of the lower concrete foundation with the frame bulkheads above, and again, just you could redo those out of concrete, match what you've got, and just parge and paint that, and I think that would be a good alternative in terms of a hardening material. And then of course you also have in several places, you do have, okay, next, this is concrete, for example, on this storefront on Federal Street, and that's certainly fine. And you can put a flood shield there at the staircase and entryway. And you have other storefronts that are of concrete, like this one on Main Street. And you know, you might need to raise. Actually, this is getting up the street so far that probably flooding is not going to be a big issue up here. But as you go a little further down, then you get into the. Yeah, I've got one more detail here of this one with the how the concrete is handled here, and this storefront probably was retrofitted maybe like in the 1930s or 40s. And then you move down the street and you've got, you know, these original brick bulkheads under the display windows on this building, and then across the street. Another example here of the brick. And this is where, you know, your flood shields would probably be fine. I think the brick is probably enough courses thick that it would give you pretty good water resistance. So I just wanted to point out those kind of materials for storefronts that in the future, as you see any of these frame kind of bulkheads allowing the water to come in, that you really end up with, you know, maybe looking at hardening these storefronts down in that lower end. And then you've got, I don't know if this is a historic building per se, or you know, more of a mid 20th century reconstruction, but that gets back again to having to redesign the openings on this building, and you know, doing more of the water resistant work under the bay window that you've got, the big display window that comes out there. But any thoughts about, you know, your commercial buildings and hardening the storefronts?
Phil, I actually do. And then
Yeah.
Val also has her hand raised. But I just want to make a comment that I think it would be very advantageous of us to include flood shields as a possibility of being able to protect these stores should the flooding continue more up towards Main Street, because we really see it more centralized on lower Main Street and then down obviously on the wharf. But obviously we do know that sea levels are rising and that we're having more flooding. And so obviously we would want to be prepared and have that kind of in our back pocket within the design guidelines to give a store property owner that capability of being able to use those flood shields. So that's just my input on that, and I will unmute Val.
Okay,
Sorry, Holly, I couldn't hear some of what you said. I think that the commercial part of town is actually a bit easier to make these switches or improvements to, because there's such a variety and there's a little bit more leeway than the average house and how to keep that traditional looking. So I think it would be successful here.
Okay.
I would also add, Phil and Holly, this is where we may need to do more work in informing property owners, commercial property owners, or those with income producing properties about the federal tax credit. Now that we have guidance from the National Park Service specifically on flooding adaptation that meets the standards, I would think that the tax credit reviewers would have what they need to assist property owners who, you know, for larger scale projects in particular, may need to make some substantial investment and would benefit from the use of that federal tax credit, either for properties that are in the commercial area or things that are inns where they don't necessarily live but are income producing properties. So maybe a little bit more education and promotion on that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Historic tax credits definitely need to be promoted more on Nantucket. I will thank you for bringing that up, Lisa.
Yeah. Okay, I guess the last little grouping of buildings I just want to mention here are, you know, what you've got on, you know, some of the historic buildings and then the newer buildings that are on your wharfs. And I know there's, you know, discussion of future development of these places and these buildings. And what do you think? What do you think this area should look like? And, you know, how do you do any sort of, I mean, should these be a commercial street? Also, you know, how do you deal with elevation along these streets? And, you know, what sort of designs would work the best? Do you go back to, you know, the kind of theme of the maritime buildings that used to be along the waterfront and the harbor? Just any kind of thoughts about that in terms of like infill design, any sort of overall concept? I kind of look at these and just what do we do with these? How do we make these hardened or elevate them? I mean, you know, they're right on the water. Any comments?
We've got 2 hands up. Yep, we've
Okay.
got one from, I'm going to unmute Mary.
So this seems like a good moment to ask a question that's been on my mind. Either Phil or Lisa could comment. Are you aware of any areas which have essentially transitioned from being a land-based environment to being an over-water-based environment? So for instance, rather than trying to maintain sidewalks and roadways and land access, we expanded from the harbor front inward more of a water-based access. You know, so instead of having sidewalks, you have piers. You know, instead of having roads, you have waterways. Are there any examples of places that have done that? And do you think there would be any applicability here?
Well, I'll tell you, the Florida Keys is planning for that because that's going to be their only alternative. So I'd have to go back, Mary, and take a look at their resilience plan, which was recently completed. But I know even in Annapolis, we encouraged in our Coastal Resource Hazard Mitigation Plan to incentivize the use of water-based approaches to houses, particularly over in our conservation district, which was Eastport, and any of the houses that were along the creek and back bay areas of Annapolis, to reduce the need for so much impervious surface. So I think that there are policies and incentives you could put in place. It always comes back down to, I think, the realization that once the land is inundated by water, you've reduced your ownership of the property. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So I don't think that's going to be as great a concern in Nantucket for as long as there's access from the rear to the buildings. I'm just not sure what the building code allows or supports for in Nantucket in that regard. That may be a little bit of research that needs to be done to understand how the building code looks at that.
Yeah, I'll take a look and see what I've seen some of these kind of concepts out there where, again, you are taking the harbor or the waterfront and just doing a total sort of transition to more of the elevated boardwalks and the buildings access that way. But yeah, that's something that I'll take a look and see if I see any communities that are actually undertaking those kind of projects. Well, it is now.
We have a hand up.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
We have a hand up by Val. Guess we'll
Yeah,
take
sure,
her.
go
That's okay.
Have you seen any little coastal towns or byways that have lifted all those little structures like that and put them on piers?
I can't think of any example beyond just like individual buildings, but not a complete sort of community-wide approach. But I'll look.
It's just an interesting thought, especially in this area, because, you know, when you go in the summer and wind your way through the boardwalks to look at the boats, there are some little buildings down there that are just on piers. There's no land at all around them. And that's an interesting thought.
There are communities actually in Virginia, and help me, Phil, Princetown. There's a community that after one of the, it may have been Maria, but I'm not sure, one of the major storm events, Princeville, thank you, Princeville, Virginia, which is an African-American community, which over the years had actually done more building on piers because of the fact that the water was encroaching, just sea level rise in general. After that event, I think that they did rebuild on piers. I'll take a look at the Princeville. Maybe Kim, just make a note of Princeville and we'll take a look at that, because they did receive substantial funding. It was a historic district, and I know the Park Service provided some planning funds for that. So I don't know where they are with their rebuilding efforts or their plan, but we can certainly take a look at that as consideration.
Okay. Any other comments about this this aspect of?
Just have a short little comment. There are several communities also in Louisiana that have migrated to living on piers of some sort. The island of Jean Charles is one of the native, indigenous native population that was there. And they actually became the first climate migrants in the US. The federal government ended up building them an alternative community because their island just sank so much that it was incompatible with life. And so I think we could take a page out of the book and of the bayous of Louisiana and the islands and everything also as communities to look at, because they are also trying out technologies such as buoyant foundations. And when there's a storm event, their house may actually float a little bit in order to stay above the water. And they've been using that for decades. But I think, you know, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from these communities that have actually been living with water for quite a while, due to being in the bayous or the water of Louisiana and Virginia.
Thank you. Anything else? Well, this has been very
Do you
helpful.
have a hand?
Yeah. Mhm.
Just moving real quick. I don't want to NCTV. Done here shortly. Got one hand raised by Diane.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Quick, Diane.
I wondered, you had mentioned, somebody mentioned at the beginning of the charrette that some, I guess it was Lisa who said somebody from Holland is coming the next time. Are we going to take part in that charrette?
Yeah, yes, that's actually the April, it's not a charrette, it's one of the last public forums. And we're looking at hosting that on the 23rd and 24th, correct, Holly, of April. So we are going to have some speakers, and I've already been making some notes based on what you stated to see if we can find others who could talk about some case study examples of just that concept of living with water, which is what obviously they do in the Netherlands. There's a planning concept called Room for the River that allows them to move forward with planning, embracing the water, much as Boston with its whole concept of living with water has done. So we'll be bringing some more information to the table, Diane. I think that that's a longer phase of how we look at things in the mid to long term. There may be some things we find that would be useful in the design guidance, but at any rate, yes, we will be.
Well, Holly, if there's
I don't
no
want
other
to take up.
comments.
I don't want to continue this too much longer. NCTV
Okay.
needs to go, so I think we should wrap it up.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their participation today. This has been very helpful to me, and it's been really good to sort of go and look at the work in the past, and what you all think as successful and perhaps not successful. So that's been very beneficial, and I really appreciate it. And please know that you can always contact me with any other comments, any other suggestions as we work through the guidelines. I'll be preparing the outline of the draft for you here this next month. And, Holly has all my contact information, and feel free to reach out to me. But I appreciate all your time and your patience in sitting down and going through several hours of design review. So
Vince, you got a last
enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Vince is going to finish us off.
Well, I saw that Mary Longacre had her hand up, and I'm just going to make a somewhat reasonable guess to say that she was going to ask that everyone be aware of, know about, and please attend the meeting on Tuesday morning. It's the CRAC meeting where Arcadis are going to be attending, and it's the kickoff meeting for the Coast Resilience Plan. I've seen the agenda. It's going to be incredibly interesting, and I can send anyone that wants the link for the meeting that's already publicly posted. I can send the link to anyone that needs it. But I hope that covers one of the things Mary was going to say at least.
I'm going to add a thank you to Phil for including so many pictures from Nantucket. It's really helpful to see, our own vernacular and our own solutions and attempts, as opposed to looking at places over and over again that don't look like us.
Thank you. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, it was important for him to be able to come, and we appreciate his being able to travel to Nantucket during these unprecedented times. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. I'm very excited about this work. So thank you, Phil, Lisa, Kim, everybody that came. Thanks
Thank
again.
you. All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Bye.
NCTV. Can't do this without you.